Greetings and welcome to this session of Berkeley Writers at Work. Thank you for taking your time on a Tuesday lunchtime to come and listen to one of our professors talk about the craft of writing. I was telling Professor Gopnik just now an anecdote about how when I published a book that was reviewed in the Chronicle, one of my neighbors came to me and said, "Mr. Stovall, I had no idea you were a writer. I thought you were just a professor." And the fortunate thing about that remark is that there are a lot of people who think in those terms. But I think one of the things we're most proud of about Berkeley faculty is the fact that so many of them are such good and compelling writers, and that they are people that regard the craft of writing in and of itself as a major part of the creation and distribution of knowledge. So I'm very proud today to have the opportunity to present a psychology professor, Alison Gopnik, who is today's featured writer, and will be talking about her own writing and her work. She is the author of numerous works, 4 books and many articles, and is perhaps most noted recently for her bestseller, The Philosophical Baby, which was named by Amazon as one of its top 10 science books of 2009, and has received numerous praise as being delightfully written, insightful, and giving parents all sorts of wonderful insights, things they might not have wished to have known about how their children think. So it is a great pleasure to have Alison Gopnik, and I'm pleased now to welcome her to the podium. Thank you.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's a wonderful chance for me to talk about writing, which is one of the things that I've always loved. I realized recently when I was in New York that I come from a family of 6 children, and 5 of us are professional writers of one sort or another. So it's very much in my blood as a writer. And I thought to read, I wasn't quite sure what to read, but I'm going to be a little self-indulgent. A lot of the point of The Philosophical Baby is to try to convey what's often fairly rigorous and hard-nosed and dry science in a way that will appeal to everyday readers, and to try and make that very clear. And that's one of the things that I work hard on doing in the book. But part of it is just to be eloquent as well. So this is actually I did a little memoir about my childhood, and I said one of the things that was a childhood value, in addition to good writing growing up in a modernist family in the 60s, was no sentimentality. That was the one thing that was absolutely forbidden in our house. So, for instance, my parents thought Waiting for Godot was a little sentimental. That was their sort of, Brahms was much too sentimental. We weren't allowed to play Brahms in the house, something like Stravinsky was a little sentimental, but he was kind of a little better. So those were the values of my family. And of course, as always with children, I've reacted against this by really liking the most sentimental parts of my books. So I'm going to read you a very sentimental part from The Philosophical Baby. And this is in the last chapter. And in the last chapter, what I'm talking about is some of the philosophical implications of what children are doing. But this is a part about those philosophical implications very broadly conceived, to include things that we typically think of as being spiritual or religious ideas or thoughts or implications. So what can children tell us about the spiritual/religious dimension of life? And what can it tell us, even if, like me and like I think the majority of scientists, one is technically an atheist. So this is about what children can tell us about love. Children can also tell us, more than anything else, about the spiritual intuitions that we might call love. Our love for our children and our children's love for us has a special quality. I said before that the particularity of our feelings about children might make them seem spiritually dubious. But the love we feel for children, not just mother love, but the father love of social monogamy and the babysitter, sibling, grandmother, next door neighbor love of the alloparent, these are both terms from evolution about love for children and care for children that's done by people other than just the mother, has a special quality of both particularity and universality. It is a powerful model for the love that underpins religious and moral intuitions. One of the everyday but astonishing facts of life is that while we choose our friends and our mates, we don't choose our children. When we give birth to a baby, and even when, as an alloparent, we take on the care of a baby we haven't born ourselves, we have no idea what that baby will be like. I may hope that my baby combines the best features of myself and my mate, while I fear that he actually combines the worst ones. Still, given the genetic lottery of human mating and the contingencies of human nurturing, the most likely outcome is that the jumbled up genes of each individual will come out looking like nothing else on Earth. Even the most basic features of what a baby is like are beyond our control, a situation that becomes vivid for the parents of children with disabilities. And yet, with some tragic exceptions, caregivers love the babies they care for. Sometimes they love the neediest babies, the babies with Down syndrome and cerebral palsy and cystic fibrosis most of all. And even more oddly, when we care for a child, we love that child, not some arbitrary notion of children in general. We love our children just for the particular characteristics that we couldn't possibly have anticipated. My oldest son's intensity, talent, and straight-backed confidence, my middle son's brown curls, wit, and intelligence, my youngest luminous smile, warm blue eyes, and sensitivity. In fact, these lists don't capture it either. I just love them, not even because they are my children, but just because they are Alexei, Nicholas, and Andres. Even more paradoxically, yet even more profoundly, our love for our children is inversely related to the benefits they provide us. Even with mates, and certainly with friends, we expect a certain reciprocity. I'll take care of your neuroses if you'll tolerate mine. The neediest of our intimates gives us something in return. But every child is needier than the most intolerably demanding friend or lover. Imagine a novel in which a woman took in a stranger who was unable to walk or talk or even eat by himself. She fell completely in love with him at first sight, fed and clothed and washed him, gradually helped him to become competent and independent, spent much more than half her income on him, nursed him through sickness, and thought about him more than about anything else. And after 20 years of this, she helped him find a young wife and move far away. You couldn't bear the sappiness of it. But that, quite simply, is just about every mother's story. And it's also the story of every human community, every constellation of mothers and fathers and socially monogamous mates, every group of siblings and babysitters and alloparents. It's not so much that we care for children because we love them, as that we love them because we care for them. These moral intuitions about child rearing aren't captured in most philosophical traditions. The classic philosophical moral views, utilitarian or Kantian, libertarian or socialist, are rooted in intuitions about good and harm, autonomy and reciprocity, individuality and universality. Each individual person deserves to pursue happiness and avert harm, and by cooperating reciprocally, we can maximize the good of everyone. That's the basic idea of the social contract. But individualist, universalist, and contractual moral systems just don't seem to capture our intuitions about raising kids. On the other hand, this combination of particularity and selflessness is very much like the love and concern that are part of our spiritual intuitions. We capture it in stories of saints and bodhisattvas and sadhikim. They are supposed to feel that combination of singular, transparent, particular affection and selfless concern for everybody. No real human can do that. And of course, there are many ways to approach that ideal and to care for others, ways that don't involve children. Still, caring for children is an awfully fast and efficient way to experience at least a little saintliness.
Should work. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. You're a wonderful reader of your own work. That was lovely. I've enjoyed reading your work so much, and I hope to put you on the spot on a number of things today. But I was glad you read that passage, because one of the things I was going to say to you is that I actually learned more about you and your family than I would expect in a book like this, in the philosophical baby. I learned, for instance, what you would like to do at the end of your life if you're not fully competent, right? You are a woman who wants to be put out of your misery. And I thought it was interesting that in a book about other things that I learned so much. So rather than starting with some of the other things, let's talk about that. what's the role of your own life in a book that's
Right.
not about your life?
Yeah, I think this is a particular issue when you're writing about children. Because almost, in fact, in the very beginning of the book, I say, you know, basically, childhood has shown up in writing over the years as either something about a memoir, about your personal experience, or else as something that you tell other people to do. So it's sort of either Irish autobiographies or American self-help books. Those are the two places where you read about children. And of course, your own experience of childhood and your experience of raising children is this very individual, particular, personal experience. So when you read books about children, almost all of them are either people reflecting on their own childhood, or there's been this whole rash recently of memoirs of people talking about raising children, including one by my own brother. And one of the points that I wanted to make in the book is that we, from a scientific and philosophical perspective, we should be able to think about children more broadly, not just in this, you know, what should I do with my children now, or what happened to me that made me the way I am. But on the other hand, and that kind of came up in that last passage that I was reading, of course, one of the things that is interesting and universal about children is that they are particular, that your own particular experience is very different and individual and can't be generalized. I think that's actually one of the important universal facts about raising children. So when I was writing, there's a kind of balance between wanting to have some of the fact that this is a person who's actually had children, who's is part of his experience, isn't just a detached scientist coming in and saying, here's the results of our studies, but not having it be a memoir and not having it be that there's any special authority for having the examples of children.
So let me ask about your son's reaction to being dragged through the mud at all points. That you frequently refer to them and discuss
Right.
their character traits. What's their reaction?
Well, my youngest son well, actually all three of my sons are hams, but my youngest son is particularly a ham. So I use videotapes of him in my 140 class as a way of teaching, was actually to show videotapes of me and him interacting, and then the students do an analysis of that, these are from when he was 2 and 4. And since he was 4, he's been visiting the last class. In fact, he's just visiting now from Toronto. He's becoming a clinical psychologist. And he said, okay, in the spring, am I coming back to the class again, now that he's 22? So he would come to the last class and talk about what he thought about what his mom had said. So I always figured that was kind of like his equal opportunity. And he has used it to interesting effect at various points. So I don't talk about my children I don't do too much. I'm conscious of the difficulty of doing that. And of course, the children always are threatening me that they'll tell the truth, and my pretensions to know anything about childbearing will be. I can tell you actually a funny story that just happened was that I did a piece on Radio Lab, which is this wonderful NPR program about kind of science. And they came to me and they said, we want you to talk about play, and I talked about play and imagination, and then they said, actually, most of this program is about sports. So we're thinking about this in the context of sports. Do you follow sports? And I said, yeah, I'm an Oakland A's fan, and I talked about sports and things I think about baseball. And then when they actually ran the program, they said, this is Professor Alison Gopnik, a fantastic sports fan. She's just, spends all her time covering the Oakland A's. And my children, who actually are fantastic sportsmen, my oldest is a sportscaster, said, I think that you can be thrown in jail for lying on NPR, maybe lying on other, but they were completely indignant at the thought that I had masqueraded as a sports fan.
I'd like to backtrack to sort of some basic things, which I think I hope will be interesting. You, in The Philosophical Baby, you're talking about executive control, which I'm not going to bother to explain, but it's sort of what it sounds like. And you are talking about how it works in adults and how it works in children. And you say, I put the chocolate up on a high shelf out of reach, or promise myself that I'll go for a walk and buy flowers after the chapter is done, but not before. So this leads into your writing habits. And I'd like to find out, you are extremely busy. You have a lab, you have to be there, you're giving talks a lot. So you're doing your research, you're teaching. When do you write, and do you have a set time? Do you have places?
Yeah, that's a good question. When is it that I do that? Well, again, part part of my picture about this is I had 3 children under the age of 10 when I came to Berkeley, not as an assistant professor. And so I sort of feel like there's this massive, and I have no memory of exactly, and people always sort of do, how did you manage to do that? And while you were teaching and getting tenure. And I think that somehow there was the slot that the 3 children under 10 were taking up that then turned into the slot for writing, but I couldn't identify then when it was, and I can't identify now exactly when it is. One thing that I do know is that I have to have a quite regular, do things in regular small bursts. I can't do things in one, I can't do things on demand quickly, so I have to give myself enough time to do that. And I don't know if this is true about writers in general, but my process is that I stare at the blank page with agony for days with nothing at all coming out. And then gradually I'll get 2 or 3 sentences. But then by the end, when I'm revising the sentences, which is most of what I do, then I really can spend 10 hours just, it's just coming out, not doing anything else. So part of my joke about this is I don't study and don't really believe in gender differences, but one gender difference that I have proposed is what I think of as the basic male curve and the basic female curve, which apply to all activities at all scales. It's kind of like a fractal. So the male curve is like this. You get a very quick rise up to a quick high point, and then you get this equally quick drop down to baseline. And the female curve, you get this much slower, more gradual rise up to this high point, which is then sustained for a much longer, or at least can be sustained for a much longer period. And this applies to everything, including career, female scientist careers and male scientist careers, and tolerance of television programs, and all sorts of things, aside from the obvious one that you're all thinking about. And at least for me, it also applies to my writing. So it takes me a long time to get started, but then I can keep going. And one piece of advice that I always give my graduate students is, and it's funny because this actually is also something that came with children, is I have 2 days a week when I have a very serious appointment, which is the appointment between me and my book. So when people ask me if I want to do, if I'm going to do things on those days, I say, no, I'm sorry, I'm already booked up. And that booking up is just time for me to do writing, which is something I recommend to all my young.
So you really do set aside?
So I really do set aside a couple of days.
And do you write at home or in your office here?
I can't write in the office because there's too many interruptions. So I write at home. And then I usually get sustained time in the summer when I'm writing.
And do you promise yourself that you'll write a chapter before you walk away? Or are you good about going in and sitting down and staring, as you say, staring at the page?
No, I'm terrible. I have to beat myself up enormously to get any work out of myself at all. At least, again, in the first phase. Then once it gets going, then I kind of can't stop. So I do get to this there's a wonderful phase late in a book where it can just be 10 hours a day perfectly happening. But I have to really force myself to get started.
Can you describe that? You said it's a wonderful phase. What's wonderful about it?
It's flow. That's the phase where I'm not, it feels like it's just getting written by itself. I think writers, I'd be interested to see what other people have said here. Writers vary a lot in how many drafts they do. So for me, I'm one of those, there's probably 100 drafts in each one of these chapters, if you actually went and counted on the computer. I mean, at least 100 drafts. So I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And towards the end of that process, that gets to be very satisfying. It gets to be like, doing a sport really well, where you know what you're doing and you know that it's going to get better as you work on it more and more. And that can actually be quite addictive.
I love what you're saying, and it's something we hear a lot, but a lot of our audience is a number of students and other people, and students don't like to hear what you said, and that is that it was 100 drafts for a 400-page book.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that you said that's crucial is that it's the stage of revising where you really are interested, that the first part is hard, and then the revising is somehow much more interesting, and that's where you spend most of your time.
Yeah, the first part is, the other part about the first part for me is getting the structure right.
And I think probably lots of people do this, so I don't really write outlines, but I work a lot on the outline in my head about here's what the structure is going to be. And I think the structure is absolutely the key. So the idea that there's going to be 3 parts to it, or that the same idea is going to be repeated, 4 different times, that's the part that I think is why I stare at the screen with nothing coming out. It's trying to figure out what the structure is. And then I can actually start writing, and then I can look at what I write and say, oh God, that was terrible, and rewrite it, and rewrite it, and rewrite it. And one of the things that's funny about my books is that people will often, so my style, self-consciously, is the sort of great American New Yorker, strunk and white, demotic style, where it's designed to be very simple and very clear and read as if it's just someone who's talking to you. And I have many times had people say to me, it must be so wonderful to write a book like yours, because you can see all you have to do is just write it just the way that you would talk. It's so simple and straightforward, and you're not doing any fancy writing. It's just, and of course that takes 100 drafts. John Kenneth Galbraith has a wonderful line about that he said that he generally finds that note of spontaneity that his critics like so much comes somewhere between the 44th and 45th draft.
So that leads me to, where is this quote? So when you're drafting and you say, oh, how could I have written that? But at the same time, you must have points where you say, ooh, yeah, that's really cool. So in the review that you and your brother just did in the New York Times, I want to read a sentence. This is her brother Adam and Alison reviewed a book together on siblings, so it seemed appropriate. And Kluger is the name of the author. And so this is one of Alison's comments. But did you share my sense that Kluger mostly cares about the confessional materials and that the scientific stuff is wrapped around it to turn a wound into a book?
No, that's not me. That's my brother. And that's much more like my brother. Sorry.
Okay, well, there goes my point. I thought it was you.
My brother's a really wonderful writer and a great aphorist. Let me see, I'm trying to think if there's something in, well, actually, I think that if you look at that, it was interesting to write that because Adam and I write quite differently, even though Adam actually is a New Yorker writer, but his writing is actually less New Yorker-esque than mine is. It's a little more Baroque, it's got more, he often has aphorisms and things that you could sort of take out, and he'll use more sort of slightly high language, like talking about a wound being a book.
I'm just devastated that I had plans.
The part that I'm proud about in that piece, which raises another issue about writing personally too, is I had a metaphor about Hurricane Katrina. So the idea was this was a book that was a science writer, but also a memoir about his own experience as a sibling. And I was saying, we, as scientists, it's almost impossible for us to predict something as complicated as how a child will turn into an adult, which of course is just the thing that memoirists and most people want to know. So most people, when you say you're a developmental psychologist, say, oh, well, could you tell me what I should do so that my child will come out this way? Or could you tell me what happened that made me be the way that I am? And one of the points that I like to make is think about something like climate change. You have this wonderful science, but it can't tell you why a specific thing happened. So in the review, I said, imagine if Hurricane Katrina wrote a memoir, that would probably be a bestseller like all those other celebrity memoirs about that blame the trail of destruction that they leave behind on their early experience. She'd probably say, what was it? I've read all this science, but I can't figure out how exactly did what happened in that warm day in the mid-Atlantic lead to this trail of destruction that's been my life. Was it climate change? Was it bad luck? Was it, she wouldn't be able to do that. So that's what I was proudest of in that piece. And I think it makes a point that is also true when I was reading that passage. I'm quite proud of the part in that passage about the metaphor about, suppose you read the novel about the woman who was taking care of the kids, which is that having vivid, concrete metaphors for a science writer, I think is almost always the currency that makes things most explanatory. And that's part of the reason for writing personally sometimes. I don't even think it's about being personal, it's about if you can be concrete and you can give an example that reads kind of like a story itself as an illustration of some more abstract idea or some more abstract concept. So that was a case where I think the concept of you have a complex dynamic system, like a climate system, and it means that it's very hard to use it to explain something particular, although you can explain it statistically. That is not a concept that people are going to relate to right away. It's quite an abstract, difficult concept, and often the secret is to try to have a story, a bit of narrative that's illustrating that concept.
That leads me to, I have a theory that I force my students to adhere to. It's called the Tollefson Star Trek Family Guy Simpsons theory. And it simply means that there's something in one of those for anything you write. And in your case, I was constantly thrilled and fascinated by your references of all kinds. So this is the the analogies and metaphors you're using. I think you love films because there's lots of film references. You're a great reader because there's lots of literary references. And I want to get to the section in the book on fiction. But so you reference, I think maybe even in your program there's one which we won't read that's on the inside. It's on Blade Runner, and projecting that you could have a TV or you could have a phone booth with a video inside of it, but not that you wouldn't have a phone booth.
Yeah.
Right. And that we can't know what the future is going to hold. But those kinds of things. So how do those come to you? One question. And two, do you care that all of your audience gets every reference? I assume, for instance, that there are references in there that people will sort of have to piece together or just go, oh yes, whatever.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Star Trek, because my very first book, The Scientist in the Crib, quite self-consciously, and people commented on that. That was just all Star Trek examples. I'm an insane, not all Star Trek, but especially Star Trek The Next Generation, which was like the great golden age of Star Trek, which
we'll
I watched
later,
with I watched with all my children. There's lots of fantastic philosophical examples there. That's a wonderful source of that, so I completely agree with you. And it is an issue. I mean, in this book, I'm trying to remember the specific examples, but during the editor, I have a good editor at Farrar, Straus & Giroux who isn't so much a kind of, line-by-line editor, but a kind of general suggestions editor. And very often the issues with him would be, is this a reference that's going to be too obscure? But it's often very hard to tell what is going to be, like Scooby-Doo, which I figured was not going to be obscure at all. That we went back and forth about, was Scooby-Doo something that people would know about as a reference or not? But some of the literary references, we've sort of gone back about, would people be able to get that? Or at least would they be able to reconstruct what you meant, even if they didn't actually know the reference? So I almost always, when I do that, try to, like give the example of Blade Runner so that you can sort of get a feeling for what was going on, even if you hadn't actually seen the movie. So one of your titles is Heraclitus, River, and the Romanian Orphans. Well, right. A title of a section. So that, for instance, you do in the first line sort of explain the river, but then let it go. So what's your hope if someone doesn't, do you have a hope if someone doesn't know immediately? Do you want them to look it up, or you just want them to read? I think for me, this is a slightly embarrassing confession, I suppose, but I suspect that for lots of people, the way that you know about a lot is because you've read, say, a review that refers to something, and rather than that you've actually gone out and read the book yourself, you sort of get a sense of lots of literature from reading other people, referring to it.
What do you read?
It's funny because when I started reading when I was very young. I was 2, which is embarrassing but true. But from the time I was 2 till the time I was 25, I just read fiction, and I read all of Jane Austen. I read all of Tolstoy. I read all of Dickens. I read all of Proust. I basically had no childhood except sitting in my parents' study and reading, and I would take books with me to school and read them underneath the desk because school was so incredibly boring. I basically did not live in the real world for the first 20 years of my life. So I read an enormous amount of fiction, and then somehow when I got into middle age or early middle age, I stopped reading fiction and started reading nonfiction. So I read a lot of history, and I read a lot of diaries. I love reading kind of day-to-day diaries and letters, which other people find completely mystifying. So something like all of Sir Walter Scott's diaries or all of Virginia Woolf's letters, when you have a sense of the texture of everyday life. I think what put me on fiction was that I got to be in my 40s, and I had a feeling that someone once said, which was that I was starting to read things like Alice Munro novels, which I still can't quite resist. I always read Alice Munro in the New Yorker. And of course, she gives you this wonderful insight into all the depths of your own life as a middle-aged woman, and then you're completely pathologically depressed for a month afterwards. And I got to the point where I sort of felt like art shouldn't imitate life because one of the goddamn things is enough. That's, so instead, I put myself back into thinking about history. The latest book that I read was Charles Mann's 1493, which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. That's my idea of really enjoyable books. But I do slip and read fiction sometimes as well.
This is going to be an odd question. Do people give you books about children?
Yeah, I get a lot of books to review and a lot of books to blurb. And
Not necessarily to review or blurb, but the gifts. Do people give you books about children? Do people give you books about your profession? Oh, you'll really like this because you're a.
Occasionally, but not too much.
So who's your, in terms of style, who do you love?
So someone who's, I mean, the writing that I like tends to be sort of transparent. So W.H. Auden, for instance, the late W.H. Auden is an example of a writer who I love reading, even in his essays as well as his poetry, because he has this just very, very, very pure, clean style. Nicholson Baker is someone who I love to read, who's got this beautiful sort of informal style. Calvin Trillin for The New Yorker is someone who's also got that wonderful sort of, this is just an informal guy who's talking to you, and then you actually look at the sentences, and they're these beautiful, gorgeously constructed sentences.
Can we talk a little bit about scholarly writing versus, so you did, you all may not know, but you do a huge variety of kinds of writing. You've written hundreds, if not thousands, of scholarly articles on your research.
Not quite thousands. That's too depressing.
But you also, you've written these books that have been bestsellers, and you write book reviews, and you write op-eds, and we have a section of an op-ed in here. So a whole variety of audiences and people. So what I think you should do, I should force you to read. So will you read the
passage from the cognition?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I should also point out something about this, which is the first author in this is my graduate student. So that raises a whole question about...
and we should talk about that, too, how that works.
All right. So here's the passage. We can now verify that the model makes distinct inferences from repeated demonstrations. In the first example, the demonstrated action sequences are ABC plus, DBC plus, as in Table 1. That is, a sequence of 3 actions, A, B, and C, is followed by an effect. Subsequently, a different sequence of 3 actions, D, B, and C, is followed by the same effect. In the second example, the observed sequences are ABC plus, DBC. In this case, the second 3-action sequence is not followed by the effect. Okay, so that's...
So no, I didn't put that in there to make fun of it, but to show the different kinds of writing. But at one point in the Philosophical Baby, Alison does say, I can force myself to follow the often mind-numbingly boring scientific papers on the neuropsychology of attention because I think the information will help me to be accurate when I'm writing my book.
Right.
And so the question is, why is that material written the way it is? And it's clearly not just in your discipline.
I don't know. I mean, some of it is that it's technical. So that article has a computational model, and if you want to describe the computational model, you have to use the technical terms for the computational modeling. But I do think a lot of the obfuscation in academic writing is just convention. Maybe it may even be one of those conventions about we're in the guild and the other people are outside, so we're purposely mysterious, because a lot of it is completely unnecessary. I should say that article, in my defense, starts out by saying, think about what you do when you're trying to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. you can have a sequence of actions. You could put the peanut butter on first, or maybe you put the jelly on. But suppose you were watching, how would you know which parts you ought to do and which parts you shouldn't do?
So have you memorized all your writing? Because I was just going to ask about the peanut butter and jelly. I mean, this is just an article. This is not. So I was going to ask, and that seems so like you,
right,
and not like a technical paper to start with making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I was surprised that it made it through, and
right,
that some editor didn't say this should go.
Well, now here's a good example of something that I'm quite proud of. That part was also written by Daphne, who's my graduate student. And I think I said to her, the way to do this is, it's a complicated idea, it's about how we understand action sequences. Let's start out with a real concrete example so the readers can look at it and get a feeling for what's going on in this. And she came up with a really nice example about the peanut butter sandwich. So I hope she learned something about, often at the very beginning of an article, when you want to give the big general idea, again, concrete examples are a really good way of doing it. But I just had an interesting experience, which is that I just finished a paper for Psychological Bulletin. Psychological Bulletin is the journal that publishes big, serious review papers. So this is a review paper about very technical computational work that I've been doing. And it's 73 pages long. It's this giant, monster of a paper that is supposed to be covering all this quite hard theoretical work. And I wrote it with a co-author. And we worked and worked and worked on it, and I went to read the last version of it, and I said, you know what? I'm not getting pulled into this. And I'm going to take 2 weeks, and I'm just going to treat it as if it was one of my books. And I'm just going to do what I do with my books, which is go through every single sentence and see if I can make it simpler, if I can throw out words, if I can get it to be in an active voice instead of being in a passive voice, if I can get the rhythm right so that it's going from one sentence to the next sentence. And I did that. I actually spent 2 weeks of days of writing just going through that 73 pages and doing what I would do on the last couple of drafts of a popular article, just going through and doing nothing but paying attention to the writing and making it simple. And it made an enormous difference even to the academic reviewers. When we got the reviews back, they said, this is long, but it just pulls you in and you can keep going and you can read it. It's sort of a pleasure to read, even though it's technical. And I was very proud of that, but that took that extra 2 weeks of work, which I don't think are usually sort of rewarded for in an academic setting.
So you mentioned your graduate student as the first author. So perhaps you could explain to people who don't know how papers like that work in terms of authors, and then I want to lead from that into the being the co-author
right.
in a different way on some of your other books and,
right.
and working with people in a different way. But could you explain first about a technical paper and your graduate students?
So in psychology, it's, I don't know whether this is true in all the sciences, but in psychology it varies, and it varies across different labs. But in my lab, sort of the deal is, if it's the graduate student's idea, then they get to be the first author, and because it's my lab, I'm the second author. If it's my idea, I'm the first author. So if it's sort of the graduate student's idea, broadly construed within the framework of my general research program. And what I tell the graduate students is, if you want to be first author, you have to write the first draft. So if you're the second author, you might write the methods and results section, but if you're the first author, then you should write the intro and discussion first, and then I'll come back and do the second draft. And I have a story that I tell my graduate students, which is slightly mean, but since there's lots of students in the audience, I'll tell you too. This is actually a story that Mark Danner, who's a very wonderful writer, told me about his experience writing for Henry Kissinger. He was an aide to Henry Kissinger. And what he did was that he had to write some paper about Russia or something, some report. And as he tells the story, he put it on Kissinger's desk. The next morning, Kissinger threw it across the desk at him and said, "Is this the best you can do?" And Danner said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Secretary Kissinger, I'll take it back, I'll write it, I'll do another draft." He went back, he did another draft, he handed it to Kissinger. The next morning, same thing, throws it across the table and says, "Is this the best you can do?" And this happened 5 times. And finally, Danner is desperate. He goes in and he says, "I'm sorry, Secretary Kissinger, I've worked and worked and worked. I've rewritten this, I've rewritten this. This is it. This is all I can do. This is the best I can do. If it's not good enough, I'm just going to have to leave your office." And Kissinger said, "Good, I'll read it this time then." And that's sort of my story to the graduate students is don't show it to me until it's actually the point at which it's the best you can do, which of course is a little cruel, but it makes this point about doing the drafts over and over and over again. So I have learned that my students don't know often, and I will sometimes say when they give me the first draft, is this the best you can do? You know, go and rewrite it 5 times, and then I'll do a second draft. And the students vary in terms of how good they are at writing, and sometimes I have to put a lot of work into the second drafts, and sometimes I don't. And the amazing thing, which I always find sort of remarkable, is that in their 4th year, they're much better than they were in their 1st year. I sort of feel like, sometimes I feel like, well, why didn't you just do this the 1st year? You know, if you'd just done this the 1st year, you would have saved all this trouble. But.
I want an iPhone app that students at Berkeley would have to have on their iPhone that says, is this the best you can do? Right? I think that's such a great idea. So working then in another realm with co-authors. When I looked at the scientists in the crib, which I think there are three of you, and I think, but you're all colleagues here?
Right.
Yeah.
No, the other 2 are in University of Washington.
So I was trying to read for style and to try to see if I could ferret out who was writing what, and I couldn't. So how do you write something like that when it's a book? How do you divide up the work?
So this is very simple. This is the reason why I'm an academic and not an entrepreneur, is that I made a deal with my co-authors on that book, which is that I would give them co-authorship as long as I did all the writing. So they got, 40% of the advance, but only on condition that I did all the writing. So that was, as I say, this is why I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm an author. So I actually, to be fair, I mean, the research in there is their research. So that was kind of the deal. And they gave me like a précis of the research that they wanted to write about. And I said, okay, but you guys can't get anywhere near the writing. I'm just going to do all the writing.
So do you have control issues with your writing?
Well, my experience is, and it's funny because I've written a lot of co-authored books, and a lot of my academic work is co-authored, and I like collaborating. But this paper, the Psych Bulletin paper, was also co-authored, and that was, I think, part of why I needed that last 2 weeks to just make sure that it was my writing. So I actually don't think that I could collaborate when it actually came to the writing, when it actually came to the sentences.
So it wouldn't be you're sitting down and you're haggling back and forth over the best way to say this.
I have done that occasionally, but really, it's my voice. And actually, this has stood me in good stead because when I met my current husband, I've only been married for a year, and we met maybe 2 or 3 years ago at a conference. And one of the things at the conference was that they gave out Scientist in the Crib in the bag at the end of the conference. So we met over one of these, it was one of these 2-day conferences. And he wrote to me, then we were emailing back and forth, and he said exactly the same question. How much of this book is actually yours? And I said, it's actually all mine. He said, oh, that's good, because I'm crazy about the person who wrote this book. I think she's fantastic. She's funny and sexy and interesting. And then I was a little worried in case that turned out to be one of those other authors as the person that I was actually attracted to.
Well, and good, he didn't need to split his affections 3 ways.
Exactly.
I was going down more co-author stuff, and it's just, who reads your work before the world reads it?
So Adam reads it before I have 2 writing brothers, Adam and Blake. Adam has read most of my work and always has very good suggestions about it. Blake, who's my other writer brother, who's an art critic, often reads it. My current husband, reads everything, even the op-eds, and is fantastic because he's a great reader. He's not as much of a writer, but he's someone who's an absolutely voracious reader, and he's sort of my audience. So it's funny because my experience with writing is it's often kind of phenomenological. It's about what something feels like, and it has a lot to do with the kind of rhythm. It's almost like you read something and I can taste whether it's got whether it tastes right or not. And when he's reading, he'll say, I stuttered there, and there's something about when you're reading something that's really well written, you just don't pay any attention to the words at all. It's just like you're sort of captivated and drawn into the argument, for example. Sort of almost against your will, you get pulled into the thing that the person's saying. And if you stutter, if there's a moment when your attention is not there, that means that the writing hasn't been effective.
So when you give it to them, I know you want their real, you want their real response. How do you always take it well?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, with those writers, those are all people who I really trust as readers. So, of course, it's always difficult when someone's being critical about what it is that you've done. And I've had other readers who were much more difficult to take, who were more critical. But no, I'm actually pretty good about. Well, my previous editor on my previous book said there's a special relationship about how people take editing, and I'm actually reasonably good about taking suggestions when they're coming.
So let me ask a little more about the editor. So what role, you implied earlier a little bit, so what role does your either former or current editor play in your work?
Yeah, well, I've had two different editors who played very different roles. So my first editor on The Scientist in the Crib, everyone described sadly as being, oh, she's a real old-fashioned editor. So she did something which I had never experienced before. When I have academic editors, I just fight them. So they take all my active sentences and put them into passives, and they take out all the we's, and it's just ghastly. So all I do is say "stead" and move everything back to the way it was before. But the editor for Scientist in the Crib, Toni Shira, who was at HarperCollins, was just a fantastic editor, and she did just what you'd want an editor to do. She would take a sentence and she would make a suggestion, and almost always her suggestion made it better than it was before. So having her as an editor was like having myself as an editor, where you go in and you say, okay, here's a way that you could do this better. And almost always, the old Strunk and White wisdom, by the way, is right. The way to do it better is take something out. Chanel said that when you got dressed in the morning, you should always, at the very end, look in the mirror and take off something. And I think that's the same way with writing. You should look at the sentence and say, is there anything that I can take out of this sentence? So she was great. My new editor, Eric Chinsky, is also the vice president of Farrar, Straus & Giroux, is more like a kind of intelligent reader. So he'll say, I think this is harder for readers, especially what he'll say is, this is too hard for readers to understand, or this is interesting and you could say more about it. But he doesn't actually do kind of line editing. So I miss having Toni as an editor. By the way, one of the things with The New Yorker that my brother always says is Henry Finder is the name of the guy who's the editor at The New Yorker. And all the New Yorker writers, Malcolm Gladwell, Louis Menand, Adams, say a lot of the reason why their writing is so good is because they have this one fantastic editor.
So what's the difference for you between, this is just a self-serving question, between someone who's reading your papers, so you're reading your graduate students' papers or your undergraduates' papers, and an editor? So what's the difference between the writing teacher or the person who's assigning writing, reading a paper, and an editor, or your brother? Or...
Right. I don't think there is one. So it's funny, I was just talking about this with
That's the answer I was looking for.
Yeah, with my father, we were talking, my father's an English professor, and we were talking about how you teach people to write. And my father edited my papers a little bit when I was young, but because I read so much, I wrote fairly well, and I learned how to write just by writing myself over and over again. This is the 10,000 hours rule, that just writing is the way that you learn how to write. But my son, my youngest son, was not a very good writer, and I was a bit surprised by that because he's a very good talker, and I realized he just hadn't had a chance to do it. And so there was a long period when I would just edit what he would do and give it back to him, and edit what he would do and give it back to him. And now he's a really good writer. I don't think there's any better way of learning how to write. In fact, I think the only way that you learn how to write is you write a draft and you have someone edit it and say, no, look, here's the way, do the same sentence, here's the way that you can do it, and it'll get better. And eventually, I think a lot of learning is like this. Eventually what happens is that person is inside of your head instead of being outside of your head. So I think a lot of times, my collaborators on Scientists in the Crib, Andy Meltzoff, for instance, is a fantastic experimenter. He's the best experimenter I know, just amazing. And essentially, the only way that I can do experiments is that I say to myself in my head, what would Andy do in this situation? You know, how would he design this experiment? And I can kind of hear Andy saying, no, that's the wrong control condition. You didn't control for this. I couldn't do that by myself at all. It's only with his voice in my head that I can do it. And I think it's the same way with editors. You get someone who edits you really well, and eventually you become that person who's going in and saying, this is terrible, go and re-edit.
And it's going to get crowded because Henry Kissinger is in there too.
Yeah, exactly.
Going. And that reminds, I don't know, I want to make this tie-in, I'm not sure it does. Jerry without looking at, I don't want to spend, Jerry the philosopher.
Jerry Fodor, yeah.
Jerry Fodor, so she has a great line, Jerry Fodor, a philosopher who I admit I'd never heard of.
This guy is sort of the Leo DeRocher of philosophy. So there are all these stories which may be apocryphal, but they're all sort of attributed to him.
But it's sort of the kind of thing I'm asking you today.
Yeah.
To think. So someone said, well, when you're writing philosophy, what's going on in your mind? What's your stream of consciousness? And he replied, it's sort of like, come on, Jerry, you can do it. You can do it. And so we can add that to the list of things. You said you always liked to write. Mm-hmm. From the time you were little. So by now you must have peccadillos and prejudices and things about style and grammar. Mm-hmm. So what are things that you love and hate when you see it in other people's writing? Yeah.
Well, one peccadillo that I have in my writing that I actually find very useful, but that in academic context particularly people don't like, is I'll very often use we for starting a sentence. So I'll say, we've discovered that children know more than we ever thought before, or now we will get to the part of the argument where even in academic writing, I'll say something like, now we see that the causal structure can be represented by this graph. And people, often there's a kind of reaction against that, but for me as a scientist, that's a way that you can kind of have your cake of the active sentence and also have something that isn't just personal, so it isn't just I. And that's very hard to do in science, is to get a way to get the active sentence to work. And I think we is for me, that's a good way of doing it. I like simple, short sentences. Again, that's my old Strunk and White, rather than long, elaborate sentences. And I like, not Latinate language when I'm reading.
So today, my students and I went over a page from the book, line by line. And one of the things we noticed, we think about rules that people are taught when they're 6 and that are not necessarily the actual rule, but they're taught that so they won't do something else in their writing. And in this one page, you started 3 sentences or 3 paragraphs with conjunctions.
Yeah, that's right.
And but.
Yeah.
And of course, I had to explain that that's legal.
Yeah.
That's
something else that I fight with editors about a lot.
Why?
Well, for me, there's, again, the taste, the phenomenology of writing and reading is being carried along. And somehow when you use an and or a but at the beginning of a paragraph, it gives you a kind of flow from what's going on before that you don't necessarily get. So I also love em dashes. And there's a big debate now in the literature about are em dashes really being overused. But I'm a complete em dash slut. I think em dashes are just fantastic. I've never found a sentence that wasn't improved by having an em dash. And I think it's because the em dashes are a way of doing the same thing that you do with a conjunction, where you can kind of have a pause, but you're not off onto the other sentence. And there's a kind of lyrical quality that I think conjunctions give, where even when you say, so another rule that I often break is, I'll say, we love our children and we care for them and I'll use a serial and a lot. And for me, that gives it a kind of lyrical rhythm that I like, a sort of sense of continuity and flow.
My students noticed that in not with the conjunction, but in one sentence where you said as,
yeah.
And thought that it really did multiply the feeling.
And the other thing that I think is really helpful with ands and buts is one of the things that's hardest when you're doing scientific writing, as I say, is trying to get a conceptual structure, which is often quite complicated, into somebody else's head. I had when you were talking about being sensitive to editors, I had a long-standing collaborator and friend who's a philosopher who was incredibly cranky person, who was the one person who I really had a hard time dealing with when he was reacting to my work. But it was always very helpful because he was critical in a good way, but he would just slash and burn in his criticism. But anyway, he said that he measured people's intelligence by how many embeddings they could hold in their head. So he described someone as saying, philosophers, by saying, yeah, he's like a 1 embedding guy, and he's a 5 embedding guy. And the truth is, a lot of scientific ideas are like 5 embedding ideas, where it's and, but, or, not, if, then, just to get the idea across. And using things like and but, using those logical connectives, is actually a very helpful way to get people to see, all right, here's what the relationships between these ideas are. So ifs, howevers, moreovers, those are just crucial, I think, if you want to do good writing about abstract ideas.
The students commented that in your very last sentence in one paragraph, it began with a but, and a however would have been grammatically also fine there, but they pointed out that it would have lost the power of the last sentence beginning with but if you had used however, because it seemed to weaken it.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these kind of academic versions of these, you know, thuses and moreovers, and they just don't work like those, you know, good, strong Anglo-Saxon but then kinds of words.
In the course of this whole series, we gather a thing called the collected wisdom of writers at work, and we pull out lines. And I think yours, one of them is going to be, I'm an M-dash slut. I really like that. I don't think anyone, it's the first time that word has been used that way with grammar. But I have to ask one more. So one thing we noticed, you do not use colons or semicolons.
Yeah.
I mean, you really don't use them. I mean, she really doesn't use them. So, explain yourself.
Yeah.
How can you not use semicolons and colons?
I think that's part of, in my role as a psycholinguist, I think what's actually happened is that there's, you know, language always has arbitrary indicators. I think the semicolon's turning into the M-dash, that's actually what's happening. I think what will happen is that we'll look back and say, just like we, you know, look at Shakespeare and we say, okay, thou is turned into you, and we can kind of watch that happening. I think we're going to see that the role that the semicolon played is now being played by the M-dash. So when I'm reading things with semicolons, I don't kind of have that automatic, intuitive feeling for, oh yeah, this is the way that the sentence is supposed to be getting structured. I do use colons in academic writing a bit, but I don't use them very much. I'd rather do a new sentence, start a but, use a wonderful M-dash.
Kids, don't try that at home. Back to a bigger issue, that is the science writing and non-science writing. So in The New Scientist, you were reviewing a book, and it was I forget the actual content of the book, but here's what you say about writing that I think is important. Popular science writers face, you should read it.
Okay.
You should read it.
Yeah, popular science writers face a dilemma. Lay people come to science with their own systematic ideas about how the world works, ideas that are often far removed from scientific ones. To explain science effectively, we need to start from these everyday intuitions and move readers towards the scientific ones. Yet we often end up simply reinforcing the initial intuitions rather than overturning them. No matter how carefully we report and interpret, the reader's final picture will often be quite different from the one we set out to paint. I'm no exception. I write, science shows that babies are brilliant learners, and readers think, if I buy the latest educational gizmo for my 1-year-old, he'll go to Harvard. This is just a terrible problem that we face all the time. So I think a lot of times in science, you're trying to get the conversation to change, and it's really an enormous wrench to get people to change the conversation from the way that they're thinking about the science to the way the science works. And you can't do it by just going at them. I mean, in my professional life, my science is about conceptual change in childhood. How is it that we actually accomplish, how do all of us when we're children go through conceptual changes? How do we get from one picture of the world to the next? And one thing that's very clear is we're never sort of starting from scratch. We're always starting from a particular place, a particular set of conceptions. We get evidence, and then we move to another set of conceptions. And that's what good science writing ought to be able to do, but it's very hard. It's like there's kind of a magnetic field that no matter what you say, so for my stuff, for childhood, no matter what I say, all right, what shall I do to make my baby go to Harvard stuff, as much as I say that's not the right question, it's not the right way of thinking about it, that's not what the science is about, it gets caught into that kind of magnetic field. And I think that's a big problem for science writers in general.
And that was the topic of an op-ed you did a few years ago in the New York Times at Christmas, which I thought was fascinating, and I tell people about it all the time, that don't go out and buy your children baby Einstein, just love your children.
Yeah.
And see, we're getting into that part that your father wouldn't like, right? It's getting a little mushy, I think.
By the way, that's an interesting challenge about writing about children in general. I actually say that in the book. One of the problems about writing about children is if you write positively about children, it all ends up sounding like a greeting card. So it's very hard to, and I find that often when people are writing about children, Alice Munro, I wish I could remember her beautiful phrase about this, in the 60s, about mothers sort of talking about my little Hitler and things, that if you had this kind of, I'm detached and cynical and I'm not going to be sentimental about babies and children, that somehow that, you get macho writer points. And if you say having children is the most fantastic thing that ever happened to me, you get, oh, you're a lady writer, it's kind of, or even worse, among women, oh, you're, betraying feminist writing or something. So it's very hard to act, but the truth is, for most people, having a baby is the most wonderful thing that ever happens to them. So how to convey that, and how to convey that enthusiasm and passion about children without, dipping over into being perceived to be sentimental is a very, very difficult challenge. And some people criticize the philosophical baby for being too, enthusiastic about babies and children.
In the same review that we were just talking about, you did something else that you don't do very often, but it was a review, and so it's not one of your books. And you used references that I just wanted to ask about and how people respond. Instead of our universal complaint that he's really smart, but he just won't apply himself, is a disguised boast. Bill Clinton's Rhodes Scholarship erased his poor Arkansas upbringing and made him part of the elite, while George W. Bush's flamboyant stupidity cancels out his rich Connecticut childhood and makes him a regular guy. Mm-hmm. So, of all the people you could have chosen and all the analogies you could have drawn, you picked George Bush, and so then immediately we know something more about you.
Right.
But is that, and I'm saying this as someone who completely agrees with you,
right.
Is that fair?
Right.
Is that fair? Did anyone, when you were, did the editor say anything? Did someone say, or they say, oh, just that's Alison and she can go?
This was in England, and in England, and this was right during the Bush administration, and in England, in that period, that was not something that anyone was arguing about.
This was just a statement of fact in England, then, I see.
I mean, I thought about that when I wrote that, but the point about that was, about saying flamboyant stupidity, is I thought, as lots of people thought, that Bush was making a point about being stupid. It wasn't just that he was, in fact, he was smarter than he made it, lots of people thought he was much smarter than he made himself out to be. And the point was that in this article was that was a signal that said, I'm a regular guy because being smart, it makes you immediately part of the elite. Now, I'm not sure I succeeded in doing that, but that was sort of supposed to be the argument. Yeah. That was the point about using the word flamboyant, which seems kind of like, usually you wouldn't think that someone would be flamboyantly stupid. They might be stupid, but they wouldn't be flamboyantly stupid. But here's a really interesting case when I was talking about my editor as well, and an interesting sort of moral dilemma that I had with writing the book. And I'm trying to remember what the context of this was. It was in The Philosophical Baby, and I said something about, I know what it was. It was when I was talking about the way that seeing other people's lives makes the circle of empathy get wider. So the argument was that babies start out having this empathy just in narrow relations, and then you widen the circle. And that's partly because you hear more and more about people. And in the original version of the book, I said, for example, as someone who's bisexual, I talk about being bisexual. I feel as if I should be talking about being bisexual because that gives people the knowledge that this isn't just a private secret thing, but is something that's more generally available. And I think by people talking about being gay or being bisexual, you get the circle of empathy widened. And my editor said, this is discordant. All of a sudden, you're writing this, and there's this thing that hasn't been in the book at all before, and now suddenly, last chapter of the book, there's a whole issue about you that people didn't know about before, and it's just too discordant. And I said, well, but it's exactly that's the reason why I think that I should be saying it, because the point I'm making is that you should be saying it because otherwise it won't be discordant. And we kind of went back and forth about it, and I caved, which I still feel slightly embarrassed about. But there's an example where it did seem like there was something that was personal that was making a point in the book, and the editor's impulse, which may not have been wrong, was that especially since it was kind of coming out of the blue, it would take another several paragraphs to make that be relevant, and it would be too distracting. But as I say, I'm sort of a little angry with myself for having caved about that one. But that's kind of like the George Bush issue. Yeah.
So, but now it'll be on YouTube, and you get your comeuppance with the editor. The final thing, I want to leave some time. Let me just ask one final thing. How do you feel that your writing has changed, or do you? Do you think your writing has changed over the years?
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten better, I hope. It's gotten simpler. My academic writing has gotten sort of cleaner and simpler as I've gone on. I'm a little less, here's an interesting question. I'm a little less shy about being eloquent than I was when I started. So I have Jane Hirschfield, who's a wonderful Bay Area poet, is a very good friend of mine. And we've had this argument a lot where I'll write something that sort of is really lyrical and eloquent and sounds sort of capital P poetic. And my brother Blake hates this. He says, he always says, oh God, you don't want to sound like you're being capital P poetic. And Jane always says, no, you should let yourself go. I think I'm more willing to be lyrical and eloquent and more obviously poetic than I was when I was starting writing, where I wanted it to just be real regular guy, very, very demotic, very ordinary kind of speech, that kind of, again, what I think of as classic New Yorker ordinary speech kind of writing.
So that leads me, though, to, I'm sorry, one more.
Yeah.
We didn't get to talk, in the Philosophical Baby, there's a long section on fiction, and it really is talking about, how children create things, and you tie it to fiction very well. But the question I wanted to ask was not so much about that, since we don't have time, but have you ever thought about writing fiction?
I don't think that I have thought about it, because I read fiction so much, and I don't think that I could do it. I think I have thought about writing, a memoir or writing something that was more autobiographical and more personal than the scientific writing that I do. But the truth is, there's a million people who do that. There aren't very many people who can do good science writing. One of my bugaboos, by the way, is that there's a big push now in science writing to make everything be narrative. So it's all. I fought a lot with the first editor of this book about, well, why don't you say, then I went into my lab and I did such and such, and my colleague who wears tweed suits, is, and you read a lot of science writing is like that. It's sort of trying to turn science into a novel. And I always feel like saying novels are fantastic, they do great work. They're not doing the same thing that science is, and science writing is about doing what science does, which is making ideas and then making them vivid and concrete and particular and using lots of examples. But it shouldn't be, here's the novel about the great scientist who made all these discoveries.
That's wonderful.
Everything. But I don't think I have enough. I think I'm too egotistical to be a novelist. To be a really good novelist, you have to have this capacity to enter into other people's lives and imaginations, which is something that I wish desperately that I could do, but I don't think I can do.
Although after reading Philosophical Baby, it seems like you do that in a different way, that you're entering into their minds.
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I do enter into the baby's mind. Yeah. So maybe if I wrote, I have thought about sort of, could I write a novel from the perspective? Could you write a novel like Nicholson Baker has this fantastic, underrated novel called The Everlasting Story of Nori that's written from the perspective of his 8-year-old daughter. It's fantastic, does a wonderful job of doing that. So that's something that I could imagine doing. And I write letters a lot. I think I learned how to write because I had a long, long 10-year correspondence with someone who was far away, and that really taught me how to write more than anything else. So I hope that the books kind of read like letters.
They do. I'm sorry, we have 10 minutes, but I just, this was too interesting. Questions from the audience, and I will repeat them since you don't have a mic. Yes?
Okay, so I have to have a bit of a disclaimer here. I came upon your writing through a recent lecture attended by Robert Bella.
That's right.
Right, so we talked about, it was a question I asked him about unity in existence, et cetera, and he referred to your work and the work you were doing with philosophical debate, et cetera. So, this has been a wonderful dialogue of its style and process, but if I make it back to a substantive item in philosophical baby, that's where you talked about the neural networks of baby being more expansive than adults. And then in this present dialogue, you mentioned also about conceptualization and how that's enriched experience. So I'm wondering, well, first, what is the evidence about the neural networks in babies becoming delimiting, and is that by environment? And do in fact, is there evidence that we can measure the conceptual process by interaction?
Well, there's lots of evidence. There's in the book, in the chapter about consciousness, I go over the scientific evidence. It's always hard to, all science is controversial. But I think the evidence that there's this period of great proliferation and then a period of pruning, I think that's something that everybody agrees about. That's kind of baseline. And the fact that it's experience dependent is something that everybody agrees about. That's kind of baseline. And the fact that there are these very radical conceptual changes that are going on as children are developing, there's debate about exactly how they take place and so forth, but I think that's something that's kind of a general.
So there's empirical evidence in measuring this delimiting of the neural networks as maturation progresses. I'm not familiar with the literature.
There are references in the book.
I teach a large class for undecided freshmen, and I want to ask a question on their behalf. You said that you read nothing but novels till you were like 25.
Right.
And I wonder how come you didn't become an English major? I mean, what was that turning point for you where you suddenly got interested in psychology, or was it sudden?
Yeah.
So, I forgot to repeat the other one. So the question is, you read novels until you were 25, and at what point did you?
Well, of course, again, this is one of these memoirist fun questions. So I have to admit, I think part of it was that I knew that my brother was a better writer than I was, and he sort of took with this is often true with siblings, he kind of took he was the one. Adam describes it as being, we kind of sat down and we divided up the world. He was going to get Paris, I was going to get London, he was going to get writing, I was going to get science. But I was reading philosophy as well, so I was reading fiction, but I always read philosophy and science and mathematics and was interested in those things as well from fairly early on. So by the time I was 10 or 11, I knew that I wanted to be a philosopher and I wanted to do philosophical kinds of writing. And some of the very best, fortunately in philosophy, much more than in science, you can be a wonderful philosopher and a fantastic writer. So when you were talking about writers, David Hume, I will just sit and I'm just, you can just savor David Hume's sentences. He's an example of one of the best stylists I know of. So I was actually reading philosophy in those things as well. I wanted to make a little other point about the George Bush while I think about it, which is being funny is a very, very, very good idea if you want to get ideas across. And I'm quite proud of the fact that the books are funny, and I put an enormous amount of work in. Again, that nice spontaneous wit, that takes a lot of work actually in the books to make that work. But there's always a problem, which is the temptation to just be snarky for me is always there. I think partly I was doing that piece quickly. In my books, I'll be sort of snarky and sarcastic about ideas that I think are stupid, and then I take all that out when I do the final draft, which is a shame because it's some of the funniest stuff in the original books. But I'm not sure if I'm too girly about, you know, not wanting to offend people so that I get rid of that, but I do that.
But isn't that sort of the rule of email, is that you write the, or a letter, that you write the letter
Right.
that you really need to get out of your system, and you never send it, and then you go back and you make the one that's going to have some effect. I would like to say that your humor, which we didn't get to talk about either, I love the fact that a lot of it is done in stage asides.
Yeah.
A lot of it is the parentheses at the end of the paragraph, and they're always very fun. But I love the fact that you are sort of talking out
Winking,
the side of
yeah.
your mouth and winking. I think we have time for one more question. I know this is that embarrassing part. We're waiting. You don't have to have a question. So I want to encourage you to look on the back of the program for some references of things you might read, especially, of course, The Philosophical Baby. But I also want to recommend the recent review on the book about siblings, which was fascinating, enjoyable to read, and gave you this added dimension to your relationship with your brother. And they're called the scientific older sister and the scribbling younger brother. So I want to thank you so much. It's just been wonderful. Thank you.